Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. I'm joined by Sheldon Richman, the foundation's vice president. This is the Libertarian Angle, the weekly internet show that brings you the uncompromising libertarian perspectives on the burning issues of the day. Sheldon, there was a really humorous article. It wasn't intended to be humorous, but it was humorous in the New York Times about a week ago about the educational system in Newark, New Jersey. Here's the situation. The mayor writes this op-ed in the New York Times claiming that the state of New Jersey has done a horrendous job in running Newark's public schools. Well, as it turns out, things were so bad back in the 1990s, the way that the city of Newark or the local school districts were running the schools. I mean, it was just such a disaster, public schooling in Newark, that the state of New Jersey took over the public schools in Newark. And so now, some 20 years later, the mayor of Newark writes this op-ed saying the public schools are an absolute disaster under state control. And he details all the horror stories associated with the state of New Jersey's control over public schools. So guess what the mayor wants to do? He wants the jurisdiction, the control over Newark's public schools returned to local control, where he's going to appoint a superintendent. He's got a plan. He's going to have another school board, and he claims that he's going to make the public schools work finally once and for all. Is there something wrong with this picture? What do you think?
Well, it's obvious what's wrong with it. You have two political jurisdictions battling over who should control the schools, and is there anybody there on the scene who's suggesting that neither political jurisdiction and no political jurisdiction at all should govern schools, but that schools should be left to the voluntary sector of society, the free market, and other kinds of consensual activities? That's going to be superior because bureaucrats can't run schools. If we haven't learned that by now, gosh, we haven't learned anything, I guess. This is just an old story, and it's true. The Newark schools, before the state took them over, were a mess, and they're still a mess. Whether they're a better mess or a worse mess, I'll leave that up to other people to decide. But look, it's the school districts that are generally regarded as the worst, which tend to be the big city districts, also spend the most per capita, per student. And so there seems to be a message there that money is not what really governs this, that the bureaucracy is what messes up schools. And we need the responsiveness that only the free market can provide.
Yeah, I mean, for 25 years, we here at the Future of Freedom Foundation have been writing articles about the virtues of a free market educational system. And we have argued that a government-controlled educational system is inherently defective. It cannot be made to work. And it seems to me that this situation in New Jersey is just perfect, conclusive proof of what we've been saying for 25 years, that when you've got an inherently defective system, it doesn't matter whether it's being run at a local level, a state level, or even the federal government level, that it's going to be a disaster. And so for this mayor to suggest that, oh, well, if you just turn it back to us because I've got a plan, is so absolutely ludicrous. Because, again, you've got a defective system. It doesn't matter. We often hear how good school teachers are and how committed they are and how devoted they are. It's really irrelevant. I mean, we know that there's good school teachers that are committed and dedicated. I have a sister who was a public school teacher. I have a niece that was a public school teacher. But the commitment of people within a bad system, within a defective system, is irrelevant, because when they're operating within a bad system, it's the bad system that is ultimately going to prevail over the good teachers and the good bureaucrats and so forth, because again of this inherently defective system. Now, why is it inherently defective? Well, I've argued that it's a socialist system. I mean, you've got this central planning mentality, top-down command and control, where the state is in there planning the educational decisions of millions of children or even thousands of children. And that's the classic example of socialist central planning. Why would we expect the results to be any different in this particular variation of socialism than it is in all the other variations of socialism?
Right. Late Marshall Fritz used to say that if you put good people in a bad system, the system wins. And so that's right. So we need not impugn people in the classroom. Some of them are very dedicated and they care a great deal and they go to great lengths outside of the rules often to try to do a good job. And sometimes they get in trouble for breaking the rules. John Taylor Gatto, a great critic of schools, not just government schools, but all schools, who spent time in public schools and also even elite private schools, points out that, to do a good job, you have to break the rules. And then, of course, you can get disciplined for doing that. So, right, the system is perverse. And the reason is it's a bureaucracy. And, of course, the first law of a bureaucracy is self-preservation. The second law is expansion. And the alleged customers, the so-called customers, they're not really customers, the students and parents, really rank way down, in the list of priorities. They're sort of the props. They are what justify the appropriations from government and the jobs and the life guaranteed jobs and things of that nature. They're just there as cardboard cutouts to justify all those goodies. What we need are markets, and the way you get a defining characteristic of a market is that you have freedom on both the demand side and the supply side. So on the demand side, parents who, in this case, for children certainly college age, would be doing the choosing for their kids in most cases, need to be able to choose anything they would like, and educational entrepreneurs ought to be free to offer anything, and then let the market test things out and let people make decisions on the basis of their knowledge and the advice they get from other people. And there'll be websites that'll include guides to the good schools and what are the bad schools. And with this freedom on both sides, then you get the kind of feedback and supply and demand that will satisfy parents in this case, and ultimately the students. It's a discovery process, like F.A. Hayek taught us. Competition is the key thing here, of course, because you have multiple providers. Is a discovery process. We learn things through the process that we can't learn otherwise, and that's really one of the great flaws of the current system. You're missing out on the whole entrepreneurial discovery process.
Yeah, I think this is one of the areas that really separates libertarians from liberals, progressives, and conservatives. They are so committed to maintaining this system in place. They all have their little reform plans, but the basic assumption of the statists, conservatives and liberals, is that public schooling is here. It's a permanent part of, quote, a free society. And we all just have to get together and figure out some way to make it work. Well, we libertarians come to the table and say, forget it. You're wasting your time. You cannot make a defective system work. And it's a defective system because it's a socialist system. It's a central planning system. You mentioned customers. I mean, these are not customers in the sense that people go to Walmart or any other retail establishment. These are people that are mandated by law to send their kids into a government-approved system. And some of them, homeschool. Some of them send them into private schools. But the vast majority send them into these government institutions. I mean, that's not a customer in the sense of the word that we use. Now, you bring up a fascinating point. This is the libertarian position, is that we believe in the free market, a free market educational system. Much as our ancestors separated church and state, they bequeathed a system to us where the state cannot regulate churches or control churches or force people to send their kids to church, or the churches are not funded through compulsory taxation like the public schools are. We want to extend that same principle. We want to separate school and state the way our ancestors separated church and state, where, as you point out, you have a free market in education where parents are responsible now for the education of each of their children, but they're also free to devise an educational program that is suited for each one of their children, and each child is different. Unlike the cookie cutter mold that we see in public schools where everybody is treated the same and there's this regimentation and conformity and deference to authority that's taught. Now in a free market system, parents are able to fashion an educational device program for each one of their children. And then you've got entrepreneurs that are competing, as you point out, for the business of families where they say, hey, look, we're providing this piano program for your student, or this overall educational system, or this one over here that teaches religion, and this one over here that doesn't, where people are now free to make choices. And you wrote this fantastic book called Separating School and State back in the 90s. I think it was 94, 95, around the time, ironically, that the Newark public schools were being taken out of the local districts. And that to me is the definitive book in the libertarian movement. If people haven't read that book, I couldn't recommend anything more. It is the finest exposition of why we need a free market educational system. The title of the book is Separating School and State: How to Liberate America's Families. So would you talk a little bit about the book, Sheldon, and what were your thoughts going into writing the book, and how you feel about it now, many years later?
Thank you. This is, I guess, the anniversary, right? It came out in 1994, so then it would make it 20 years old this year. And I didn't want to only present the pro-market case for freedom in education. That's a big part of the book, but I also wanted to bring the historical perspective to it. I mean, after all, the schools get started in the United States beginning in late 1830s in New England, Massachusetts, for a reason. The reason wasn't that there was a deficiency in what we think of as basic education. In other words, literacy, knowledge of arithmetic, those basic things. In fact, the United States in those days was a very literate society. It was becoming more so. There's all kinds of signs back to the colonial period how well-read Americans were. I mean, after all, pamphleteering, everybody knows, was a major industry and helped foment the revolution, the intellectual revolution. Thomas Paine and people like that, newspapers, many newspapers throughout the colonies and young states compared to, say, Europe. And there's lots of evidence about this, and the book presents some of it. The schools came about because the public schools, what they call the common school movement, began because of what the private system, which also involved homeschooling and various kinds of private organizations and mutual aid kind of arrangements. The state system, the government ruled system, aimed to do something that free system, I don't like to call it system because it sounds so close-ended, but that open environment wasn't doing. Namely, it wasn't molding children in according to a preconceived notion of what the good American citizen would be. That's what the government schools were intended to do. Not just teach basic things, basic skills like reading, but to actually mold the young children, which were described by various education theorists as wax and as identical at birth as Fords, into the good citizen. Now, the model was the German system, the Prussian system. In fact, we still have the term kindergarten, which is a German word for the children's garden. That's where children were grown and nurtured into what the people who foresaw the future society. They wanted to nurture children into the citizens who would fit into that society. And so they copied the Germans. Horace Mann, who's considered the founder of the common school movement in Massachusetts, who in an earlier time was a phrenologist. It shows you the kinds of things he was interested in. That's the discredited science that you could tell a person's character by the bumps on his skull. He was a practitioner of phrenology for a while, and then he turned to the schools. And so it was a planning mentality project. In other words, we're going to plan the good society by getting kids when they're young. The adults are lost causes, they said in those days. They're already grown. They're fixed in their ways. They have vices. We're not going to be able to reform them. But let's get the kids early and turn them into good citizens. And part of that meant sorting them out. There was a book written in the 70s, I believe, by Joel Spring, a radical critic of the schools, called The Sorting Machine. And the point was to think of a sorting machine. Find the kids who are good for factory work. Find the kids who would be good for the military. Find the kids who would be the future civil servants, bureaucrats, and and then the ones who look like someday they could be president of the United States. Of course, they get shepherded along into elite schools. I mean, it was a very self-conscious plan. They would have, I assume, done it at the national level. Except that the American temperament back then, and less so today, didn't want those things done at the federal level. So they did it at the state level. But by the progressive era, by the turn of the 20th century, just about every state, the South was the last to go, every state had what we think of today as a comprehensive state level so-called public education system. And it was it was done for a purpose. It wasn't just, we have to make sure poor kids are educated. If that were the only purpose, why did they just subsidize poor kids? I mean, if that's all they wanted to do, why wouldn't they have proposed something modest like that? Instead, they ran the schools, right? They created the schools. In some states, they tried to outlaw private schools. Luckily, the Supreme Court didn't permit that in the early 20s. There was a case against that. But that was the plan, to shape and mold children. Children were wax, they said.
Well, and I remember you writing an op-ed when this book came out, Separating School and State, back in '94, arguing that the public schools were really a big success. And I remember that op-ed got wide play. We had an article about it in the Financial Times about the book. And your argument, I found just absolutely fascinating, where you talked about this concept of the good little citizen. That the objective of public schools was to mold the good little citizen, the one that defers to authority, that doesn't challenge or question things at a fundamental level. And your argument was that from that standpoint, it has been a tremendous success. If you look across American society, you have all these adults now, automatically accepting whatever the government says, especially with respect to foreign affairs. That praise the troops and thank the troops for their service, and they're over there defending our freedoms when they're bombing wedding parties and invading countries and torturing people, and that if that weren't the case, we would be falling to the terrorists and the communists. I mean, people just fall for this stuff hook, line, and sinker, the WMDs in Iraq, because they've been taught to do that in the public schools, beginning with that Pledge of Allegiance, which, by the way, was written by a socialist. And continuing through the day, that slowly over that 12-year period of time, that person's mind is molded. And I remember that article you wrote that said, hey, public schools aren't a failure, they're a big success.
Right. I think they've done really what they were supposed to do. I mean, there may be some parts of it that the founders of the schools would be unhappy about, but I think this is why one reason the conservatives are sort of torn. You see conflict in conservatives. On the one hand, they do pay lip service to the market, the free market, and competition. They'll say that's a good thing, and they favor it in certain ways. And so they, when it comes to the schools, especially when they're so obviously bad, they'll say, let's have competition. On the other hand, they do like the idea of there being a sorting machine and a shaping mechanism to turn children into good citizens as they see it. It may differ from other people's models of the good citizen. And so I think there's torn there. There's some conflict there. They want this mechanism to do that, to guide the nurturing of children. But I think when they realized they had lost control of it, for example, when the Supreme Court struck down prayer in the schools in the 60s, and other loss of control, as they see it, to progressives, they then decided that even though they liked the mechanism, it's outside of their control now. So they were willing to entertain other ideas, and they thought of their old, their good feelings about competition. So they've come up with this sort of middle way namely a voucher, where you get some element of competition because the parents can shift the tax money that finances their children's education, from a government school to a private school. Now, we've criticized that. My book criticizes it, and FFF has criticized it over the years as not really reform. You could say in some marginal way it's slightly better, but on the other hand, it also holds the seeds of its own corruption, because with government money comes the power to regulate and to burden, and we know that that's already happened. But I think that's why conservatives favor it. It's they see it as sort of a market way to get what they want now that they've kind of lost essential control of the schools to progressives. If they could get the schools back, I have a feeling they might decide that vouchers weren't so great anyway. And let's plan the kids' education so we can bring them up to be good people who support the troops and, support America's wars abroad.
Yeah, I on the indoctrination part, I should have mentioned that the concept of freedom, that Americans honestly believe that this welfare warfare state way of life under which we live and have lived for many, many decades, most of us now have been born and raised under what we call the welfare warfare state, that is freedom. And that's been the big success of this indoctrination. I think my favorite quote of all time is Goethe. And Goethe's quote sums up the plight of the American people that is rooted in public schooling. And that quote is, "None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free." I mean, what better slave could you have than the slave who thinks he's free and praises the government for bringing his freedom to him, because he has no incentive to break his chains. And that, to me, is the biggest success of public schooling, is they teach kids, they ingrain in the kids this concept that you are living in a free society. And by the time they get to be 18 and they believe it, they're convinced of it, nobody's going to convince them otherwise, and they go all the rest of their lives living in this dysfunctional society, wondering why there's violence and chaos and perpetual crises and perpetual wars when this is the best freedom can do. And on the voucher thing, absolutely we've condemned it. That this is just another welfare plan. This is one of our big beefs with conservatives. As you point out, they preach their little mantras of free markets, private property, limited government, the old Reagan mantra. But when the rubber meets the road, they just can't walk the walk, to make some metaphors there. That vouchers are nothing more than a welfare plan for the middle class. You've got government taking money from everyone through the tax system and providing this grant, this subsidy to certain middle class families. And you're right that conservatives they call this a free market approach to public schooling. Well, that's ridiculous. What they're really doing is putting an entire sector of the private educational system on the government dole. So a school that takes this money is out there hiring school teachers. They're building buildings. They're expanding their budgets because now they've got this additional money to spend, and they become dependent on it. The following year, they need that money to be paying for those school teachers. And so all of a sudden they have a vested interest in continuing this voucher system. So the original notion that vouchers would help put the public schools out of business is just nonsense. It actually strengthens the government participation because the government extends its tentacles over to a private sector that otherwise would be entirely voluntarily funded. So we've condemned this thing from the very beginning. What we've said is that there is only one solution, and that's the free market. And I don't understand why conservatives are so resistant to this libertarian idea of totally, as you put it one time, throwing the state out of school. Separating school and state, because we all know that the free market produces the best of everything. It produces, if you look at anything in the marketplace, and we can see that it's always the free market that produces the best of everything compared to the government, like the Postal Service and other things, Amtrak, that the government does. So why are Americans so resistant to embracing our heritage? And that's the heritage of the American people, is a free market heritage. Why is it that they're so resistant? when we know that a free market educational system would be the best thing that could ever happen to children. And you mentioned the poor. I think the poor, Sheldon, pay the biggest price for this dysfunctional system. I mean, President Obama won't even send his kids into public schools there in D.C. because he knows that this is a highly destructive system. It's not, if it were just benign and just neutral, that would be one thing. But we know it's not. It actually destroys a person's mind. It does permanent damage. And to me, that's the biggest argument for a free market system. Every parent ought to be saying, I'm not going to subject my children to this system of regimentation, indoctrination, and memorization, and deference to authority. I'm going to support this libertarian notion of a total separation of school and state.
Well, and the consequences that ripple out from the schools, especially the inner city schools, are monumental and devastating. I mean, we have people bemoaning the economy, people who can't get jobs, or people who are stuck in dead-end jobs, minimum wage jobs, people who are not prepared for the new economy because of all the high-tech knowledge people need. Those problems emanate from the fact that the schools are so bad, especially to the most marginalized members of society. The upper middle class schools, the wealthy districts, are closer to being competent because parents there have clout, and the bureaucrats are a little afraid of them because they have money, and they may threaten to vote people off the school board. There's actually a bit more responsiveness there, and the schools are better there than you find in the inner cities, where they don't care about the people. They're marginalized. They're people busy scraping a living together to feed their kids. They're not going to be attending the school board meetings. They don't have the time, and so those kids now, and they're like their parents and like their grandparents and like their children and grandchildren, are on this track to the dead end. And they're going to get left behind. It's being written about by lots of people. They're going to get left behind, or are left behind already, by the high-tech economy, where you need to know stuff about computers and the internet and things like that. And then, of course, that creates a big constituency now for raising the minimum wage and other kinds of intervention, which don't help them, but it gives more power to the politicians and the bureaucrats. So the schools, are not just some minor thing where, oh yeah, we could have better schools, too bad we don't have better schools. It has far-ranging consequences for the people who are most vulnerable. And it's the fault, some people say it's the fault of the free market, but I look around and saying, what free market? I don't see the free market, so how can it be the fault? The free market was nowhere near the scene of the crime. It's got a great alibi. It didn't exist. And so but of course that's the typical thing. You blame the market, and when it's the bureaucrats who are at fault. Their grand plan is a total failure from the point of view of the welfare of the children. It may be a success from their point of view, but it's a failure from the point of view of the actual children who are supposed to, allegedly, in theory, the beneficiaries.
Yeah, and the root of it is the system, because, there's this notion that if we just get better people in public office, better administrators, better superintendents, better members of the school board, that somehow or another things are going to be different. They're never going to be different. That you've got an inherently defective system. So people that are devoting their lives to improving the system, they're just wasting their time, they're wasting their lives, they're wasting their money. And but one of the and I know we're about out of time, but one of the most humorous aspects to this, to me, is that when we suggest that parents should be in charge of the educational decisions of their children, the statists say, "Oh no, you can't trust parents. They're too incompetent to handle these kind of decisions." And so my question is, oh really? Why is that so? Aren't all these parents products of public schools? So here they've produced this entire generation or generations of incompetent parents with their system, but they want their system to continue so that they can continue doing it to another generation. And anyway, that's the Libertarian Angle. We're out of time for the day, and I'm Jacob Hornberger, and that's Sheldon Richmond, and we'll see you next week.